Okay, a lot of cisgender women on my recent videos are really mad at me because I said that being a cis woman was a privilege, and they were like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Being a woman is not a privilege. That's true. Being born a woman in a patriarchy is not a privilege. You are absolutely oppressed by being a woman, and no one's denying you that. The privilege is to be born cisgender. The privilege is to identify with what you were assigned at birth because the world is built to accept you. You don't have the same barriers to healthcare, housing, social acceptance, pay grades that transgender people do. Even though you may not have it great because you're a woman, you don't have it twice as bad because you're trans. Look into Kimberly Cranshaw's work about intersectionality because she breaks it down so much better than I do, and it's Black History Month, so go learn your Black history because this woman is amazing. She talks about how you can have intersecting identities and how you can hold privilege in some identities and marginalization in another. For example, I have the utmost privilege by being a white person, right? But I'm also transgender, and so in other circumstances I don't have privilege, and those two things intersect. The same is true for being a cisgender woman. I hope it helps.
It seems as if all political discussions today center around the concept of privilege. Privilege is this evil thing that makes all men, all white people, all rich people into horrible human beings who are incapable of empathy and who use the subordination of others for their own benefit. Of course, in reality, it's not nearly so simple. One can be privileged on one axis and be oppressed on another. Another interesting aspect of the discussion is misunderstanding what privilege is. People will call being beautiful a privilege, being intelligent a privilege, or simply being hardworking a privilege. While it is true that some things, like appearance or intelligence, can be used to get better treatment, that is far different from concepts like racial privilege or gendered privilege, wherein the thing that is considered to be better is a justification for mistreating another class upon which the experience of privilege relies. So today, let's discuss. What is privilege? Privilege is defined as a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. One could use this to describe something such as having designated seating for the elderly or pregnant women on a bus or train, but few of us would describe that as a privilege, as it is instead a concession made to help those who need the seating due to physical factors such as age or health. Perhaps a better example is segregation in the United States. There is very little genetic diversity between all human beings, as we all share a common mitochondrial Eve, and melanin differences are simply a result of our environment. They do not at all relate to intelligence, empathy, or humanity. So when race was used as a justification for keeping two groups of people separate, with one group relying on the labor, subordination, and oppression of the other to experience events such as cheap labor, better job opportunities, and preferential treatment, we can highlight this as an example of unwarranted inequality. So the conclusion here is that privilege is defined as when inequality is unjustified. A recent recognition of how privilege affects people's daily lives has led to privilege being wielded like a bludgeon, with the underprivileged and oppressed class using those traits to justify their inclusion and authority in various discussions. On the other hand, this has allowed certain voices to finally receive recognition in places like government, charity, and academia. On the other hand, it has upset the status quo, which means that those who were initially on top had access to those fields and are now being set aside for new voices are unhappy. To retain their order and authority, they must find ways to discard their privilege. And sociology, status refers to the relative rank that an individual holds, with attendant rights, duties, and lifestyle, in a social hierarchy based upon honor or prestige. A status set is the collection of various ranks, with a master status presiding over all others. For example, I can be defined as a woman, a daughter, a writer, a citizen, a teacher, and many others. However, the first thing people will notice about me is that I am a woman. For me and many other women, that is the master status.
Cisgender privilege means not having to consider being exhausted physically and emotionally.
I hate to burst your bubble, but it looks like it's going to have to be me who does it, right? I am no more privileged than you are because I identify as the sex that I actually am. You've made the decision not to do so, that's your issue. You cherry pick your information and you forget that being a woman in plenty of places in the world is actually deadly. You don't have access to education, you get sold as child brides. Those women don't get a choice, they don't get to play pretend. Being a woman in certain places is a death sentence. I wouldn't call that privilege, would you? You've made a decision and you cannot blame other people for not adhering to what you have decided is what you want to do, right? So it's like you can't come on social media and decide what people can and can't say because people have free will, they have free thought. Take that exhaustion out with yourself, it's something that you have chosen. It's no one else's problem but yours.
Most often, it is race or gender. So, you might wonder, what group of people is most disgruntled with the current changes? Those who have been historically in the most privileged group are white men. Just as desegregation and the success of civil rights required people to be willing to give up some of their privileges, read, the ability to denigrate and abuse those deemed beneath them, along with the transformative power of activism and protest, so too will a successful and widespread liberation of women and people of color require some agreement from the oppressive class that inequality exists, rather than merely being an unequal but just order of things. This will likely be a more complex and more extended battle than that of race, as oppression based on sex in patriarchal societies are omnipresent and exist the world over. Convincing men to agree to relinquish or redefine what power is an uphill battle, not in part because of a lack of empathy and understanding as to how being of the female sex impacts your daily life. We live in an exciting time wherein power is still primarily wielded by white men, something which can be observed via who represents us in government, who controls wealth, and who is most favored by the current structure of society. Yet, power is linked to a perceived lack of power. It is an expression of the meek inheriting heaven, wherein attention, voice, and often positions of power within organizations are being given to those who illustrate a lack of privilege, turning oppression into a point of leverage. Additionally, these positions of power often have extra privilege, wherein questioning them on or using their power, actions, or qualifications is seen as offensive and bigoted. Hence why the most prominent Black Lives Matter charity was able to use funds to purchase a $6 million house, to pay family members and friends high wages, and eventually led the co-founder and executive director, Patrisse Cullors, to a book and production deal with Warner Brothers, without criticism or oversight until long after the money was spent. White men cannot change the color of their skin. They cannot force their way into power again by claiming to not be privileged by race. However, postmodernism and anti-essentialism, two philosophical concepts which praise the idea of there being no set or innate aspects to anything, no requirements for a definition to apply to an object. It allows men to identify as the oppressed class of women, or, more recently, the idea of being non-binary. The concept of gender nonconformity, even if only in name, being an aspect that can illustrate a lack of privilege, is relatively new. Gender nonconformity has always been punished, but only recently have men been able to wield it to gain power rather than simply being a form of personal expression. One only has to look at several prominent transgender-related cases to see how this has been used in practice. For example, Dwight Even Chosom, a convicted and registered sex offender, was recently arrested for working with children and bail jumping after volunteering at a dance studio without having a background check conducted. Background checks are a common and often required aspect of working with children. As a nanny, every job I have ever worked did not begin until after a background check was completed. And yet, this is not the only case of a trans-identified male working with children without having a background check, which would have revealed their pertinent criminal background. Other cases, such as 2019's Alberto Garza, who was a participant in Drag Queen Storytime and holds a conviction for assaulting an 8-year-old boy, is another example. The Houston Public Library that he worked at admitted to neglecting to do a background check. It's almost as if organizations do not want to do background checks for trans-identified males due to an avoidance of the implication that they might be groomers or criminals, which in turn leads to them hiring actual predators out of ignorance. In comparison, those who have been lauded as privileged for being pretty or intelligent are not nearly in the same position. While it's true that intelligence and beauty are not always because of an individual's actions, beauty does not actually bring any real power. It does not give political power, it does not provide economic power. It is a reliance on a gender-specific currency that can be devalued by others, namely by the judgment of men, at any time. It does not last long. Beauty only lasts until one age, meaning that one can only wield it until a certain age. There is no age limit to power for being white or male. One is white and or male their entire life. Being intelligent is not necessarily a trait within one's ability to influence or change, but just because someone is smart doesn't mean that they have the drive to do anything with that intelligence. Intelligence or beauty on its own doesn't accomplish anything. One needs intrinsic motivation and internal ability to get them anywhere. So when people argue about privilege, it's important to note that it's pretty simple. It is preferential treatment when one does not deserve it. When a disabled person needs a specific seat on the bus, they are not receiving preferential treatment without reason. It is because they have a bodily issue that requires it. When a trans woman gets Woman of the Year, or gets book deals, marketing deals, and lots of money for talking about days of girlhood that he has never experienced, that is preferential treatment. It is a treatment that they would not receive if they were actually female. You can tell that it is unwarranted and that their being male and white are aspects of why they received it because other women have not. No woman has been given fame, fortune, or anything else because they talked about their girlhood candidly. For this reason, all the men who identify as trans or non-binary or some other kind of gender are not oppressed. They're choosing to identify as what they perceive as an oppressed group. They're choosing to LARP as an oppressed group. They are choosing to use language which allows them to present themselves as being just like you, women of the world, people of races who are oppressed, those who grew up in poverty and in impoverished countries. These white men who are primarily middle class, college educated, and in a country which values these traits, are they really like you? This, dear viewers, is where we part. I think this is a good video to have, especially after my last one about pretty privilege. This is definitely a broader topic, and I think it's important to point out what privilege is when people use the term so much and they don't even know what the word means. They just use it like something to shut down the conversation with. I hope you found this interesting, and let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'll see you guys next time. Bye!